After that brilliant presentation, I wouldn't call it a presentation, I'd call it a message from the pulpit, so to say. I mean, it's difficult for a mere economist to say anything which is even vaguely useful, except economists are by nature the carriers of dismal news in some sense. I mean, that's what they're known as. Now, one of the reasons I'm late here is a traffic jam. And a traffic jam is an almost generic problem with commons. I mean, they occur when devices which are supposed to control movement degenerate, and either there's too much movement, or what is usually a consequence of too much movement, too much free movement, is that there is a jam. I mean, that's the nature of traffic jams. And I think, really, if I wear my dismal hat and take on from where we just took off, let me say three things right away. The first is, I agree with everything that was said, but my profession forces me to think less optimistically on the future. Although, mind you, I think, let me state right away, I share the vision, even though I don't have the entire amount of confidence on it. I think that discussions of this type are dominated by three words. The word commons, the words public and goods, put together public goods. Unfortunately, the use of this, as was quite clear from what he said, are sometimes loaded against those who are arguing against property. The fact is that commons are known best, at least to the literature I am familiar with the notion of the tragedy of the commons. Commons are good things, but they get crowded, just as in the case of traffic jams. It is something which simply gets too crowded, and when it gets crowded, everybody tries to work out in this commons their own immediate agenda, creating chaos to the detriment of everyone using the commons. Now, the idea of the tragedy of the commons is clearly the one thing which has pushed for the notion of private property. That is, exclude from the commons and then put upon itself a discipline which comes from the definition of property, to which, of course, you have to have the market, which is a definition or a protocol by which those who own property can actually interact amongst themselves. There is, of course, an alternative, which is the traffic lights, which fail often, which is we have a set of controls without actually assigning property to any of this. In other words, a self-selected mode of discipline about the use of commons. Now, both of these ideas have been around for a very long time, but unfortunately, over time, what has happened clearly is social rules for behavior on the utilization of commons, while remaining commons, has by and large given place to its alternative, which is exclusion and the disappearance of the commons. You can call it enclosure, you can call it straightforward primitive accumulation. I mean, that's the way that's the way capitalism started. To create property and thereafter markets from something which did not have individual ownership and did not have individual exclusion. Property creates the exclusion and markets then enable exchange amongst those who can exclude others. I mean, that's the problem of commons. It runs into a literature which says that this essential thing, beauteous as it may be, is prone to very bad use by uncontrolled human beings. In a sense, the original argument against commons was the argument against anarchy. And it is both capitalism as well as socialism, the two ways of dealing with the commons, one exclude, the other control and have rules, found anarchy, obviously, the thing which they would together have to actually confront. Well, that's the problem with the commons, that we are coming from a brilliant lecture which really eulogizes anarchy as something which into tomorrow's goods. Public goods, as economists define it, are goods from which you cannot be excluded. Essentially, public goods are goods which are very useful things. It's the sort of things which need to be created. But the economic literature on the public goods essentially says, here are these brilliant goods which needs to be created. But the problem with public goods is, since you cannot exclude, the private sector will not produce it. So the whole point about public goods led to a literature which essentially, for most of the time, in most textbooks still, say that the government has to come in. It is public goods require that the public sector has to produce public goods, because the private sector won't, unless you are excluded, unless you can exclude, not produce enough of these public goods, which are good things. That's where patents come. The whole idea of patents was to try and create property-like creatures in things which are intrinsically public goods. Things which should not be excluded, which by their very nature are non-excludable. But law, that amazing creature of the human mind, has of course always, and this was again I think the main point you heard just now, has always created property where none existed. The arena which you are dealing with is, can ideas be made ideas from which some people create the ideas, and these same people can exclude others from using those ideas which they have created, which might be used for some other purpose. Now, of course, the whole idea of law is precisely to create ways in which you can create exclusive ownership. Much of law has consisted precisely of defining ways in which, of course, lawyers have a harder time than a lot of other people because they've got to get a whole community of people to agree on notions of assignments which then become something which other people have to conform to. And I think in one very simple way, probably there is in the arena of law, I mean, this is something I'm just thinking on my feet at the moment, probably in the arena of law, where anarchy might be a better thing, better, bad, worse in this case, but better in the long run than something which is not that anarchy. What I'm talking about is statute law rather versus case law. Case law, by its nature, is somewhat more anarchic than statute law. And I think more property has been created by case law rather than by statute law. At least the sort of properties that we were alluding to. In other words, anarchy needs to confront the fact that there will be individual minds which will see the merit of using ideas to exclude others of something. I mean, that is the nature of law. This will not happen to that extent if this is put up to a democratic process where legislation has to be made. It will, however, happen when there is a process by which, over a continuous period of time, you try to define certain types of rather abstruse ownership and abstruse exclusion. This is the way in which a lot of things have happened. Of course, patent law is not one of those. WTO is not one of those. Those are statute law trying to actually take the place of something which was created before that. The point I'm trying to make is the following. And this is where I agree fundamentally, which is that knowledge, by its very nature, is something which gains the more access to other people's knowledge it has. In other words, it is something which has such huge economies of scale and such huge economies of networking that anything which prevents the space through which knowledge moves, the number of people who share that knowledge, and the number of people who can communicate with that knowledge, it will actually mean less returns to that knowledge. I also agree with the other fundamental thing which was said, which is ultimately victory will be with those who have more productivity than the other guy. And if you cannot, I mean, if productivity grows, if the ability to use knowledge is with those who have more of it than those who try to use that knowledge and get the most of the knowledge by excluding others, then the battle will be won by those who are not trying to keep people out, but by the people, those who somehow have been able to be in a network and manage more of it. It's simply the economies of scale winning them out in the economies of network.